Hello and welcome back to Uncle Sal's Garage. On today's episode, we're going to check our crank, bearing, and rods for proper oil clearance. We're going to break out our micrometer, our dial bore indicator, and a bunch of other tools I've never used before and have some fun. Then we're going to test fit everything to see how it feels. And lastly, we're going to break out the kitchen scale and measure our rods to ensure our reciprocating mass is in harmony. Let's get started. Before we dive in, let's recap what we've done to the motor so far. This is an old 1.7 out of my uncle's 1976 Porsche 914 that we removed when we built his 2056 motor. I'm using it for the case only, as my 2270 build necessitates pretty much all new everything. What I hadn't filmed is the teardown process, but I took some shots to share with you all here. So now you're all caught up. I have a torn down 1.7 with the case halves cleaned and mounted on the engine stand, ready for work. Step 1. Measure, measure, measure. I began by creating a spec sheet with all of the target range measurements for the crank journals, as well as oil clearances. These figures can be found in Tom Wilson's great book, How to Rebuild Your Volkswagen Air-Cooled Engine, as well as via the 914 World Forum. I started by carefully measuring and remeasuring all the journals on the crank. A popular theme here is this is my first time using many of these tools, so I took several measurements and averaged them out. I then compared them to the spec sheet. At this point, all of our crank journal measurements were on spec. Next, I needed to install the bearings into the case and torque everything down so that I could take measurements for proper oil clearance and bearing roundness. This was my first time using a dial bore gauge, and it took a little while to get the hang of it. But after redoing my measurements over and over and over again, I eventually started feeling good about the readings I was taking. Finally, it was time to plastic gauge the rod bearings on the big end to ensure proper oil clearance. It's really hard to get everything snugged down without smearing the plastic gauge, as you can see from these after shots, but I think I did okay. Okay, I just got finished measuring all of the rod journals on the crank, and I'm getting pretty consistently here between 0.002, 0.0025, and that's me going in between the two numbers on the plastic gauge, 0.002, etc. And according to Tom Wilson's book on page 118 here, he would be happiest with 0.002 to 0.0025 clearance. So that's pretty much bang on what we got. So here's my final spec sheet with measurements. All in all, most of the figures are looking good and indicate that I'm ready for my next step. Step 2. Test fitting the crank and rods. In the previous step, I had the bearings in the case so that I could test for oil clearance and bearing roundness. Now I had to get the bearings out of the case and onto the crank so that I could reinstall the crank and bearings into the case to test field's rotation. Okay, wet fitting the crank into the case, and it looks like we're going to have a clearance issue with the stroker crank because it is hitting right there. Spins okay. I wanted to check how freely it was spinning. That was the point of today's work, but unexpectedly, there, hits. So I don't know. I'm gonna have to figure out how to clearance the case. Okay, clearancing the case with my little Dremel. Almost there. That's the latest mark that it made when it was spinning. I'm just gonna Dremel that out just a bit. Dremel's over there. Be back in 2 minutes. And there you have it. I took about that much off the case so the crank could spin freely. Right, this is the first test fit of the crank installed after clearancing. I got my bearings in there all oiled up. Let's give it a spin and see how bad it is. Okay, not terrible. Definitely feels like it spins freely. I don't sense any binding. Maybe a little there, but not really. I mean, there's no flywheel on it. It rotates. It continues to rotate even after I sort of let go of it. So I mean, that feels pretty good to me. Definitely no binding. And that's a successful test fit of the crank. I was really happy with how freely it was spinning. Now it's time to move on to test fitting the rods onto the crank. Okay, in today's installment of Today I Learned that when you're finger tightening the con rods, they are way tighter than when you actually apply torque to them. And that makes sense because as you torque the con rods down, the bushing creates a circular sort of cavern where the oil sits, and that's really cool. It was super tight, and then it was not. So these, I think, are to spec at this point. Step 3, measuring the rods to check for balance. So I have your very basic kitchen scale here with some plastic wrap over it so I don't contaminate my food later. And I have all my rods, bearings, and bolts numbered off and set aside. So let's begin the process of measuring each to see whether they're all in alignment. Using my kitchen scale, I measured each set of rods, bearings, and bolts. I measured each set twice and recorded my findings in my spec sheet. What I found was each set was within 1 gram of each other, meaning the heaviest set was only 1 gram more than the lightest set. So I'm going to call these on spec and ready to install. Up next on Uncle Sal's Garage, assembling and installing the crank.